Julian Croft existed in a world of polished glass and muted chrome, a silent kingdom 40 stories above the ceaseless rain that slicked the streets of the city into black mirrors. From his corner office, the metropolis was an abstract concept, a grid of distant, flickering lights. The rain was not something he felt. It was merely an aesthetic, a moody backdrop to the sterile quiet of his life. Inside, the air was still and cold, recycled and tasteless, much like the conversations he endured daily. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, his reflection a sharp, lonely silhouette against the storm-darkened sky. The pressure from the board had been relentless, a constant, low-grade hum of expectation and veiled threats. They spoke of legacy, of his father's formidable shadow, but what they meant was profit margins and ruthless efficiency. His father had built Croft Holdings into an empire on a foundation of unyielding ambition, a foundation Julian now felt was slowly turning to dust beneath his feet. Tonight was yet another mandate, not from the board, but from the trustees of his father's estate. A blind date. The words themselves felt absurd, a relic from a simpler time that had no place in his meticulously scheduled existence. It had been arranged by a woman whose entire career was built on forging strategic alliances through matrimony, a service his father's will had stipulated he must use. He was to meet a woman deemed suitable, a term that, in his world, meant she had the right pedigree, the right look, and the right, empty ambition to match his own. He loosened his tie, the silk a suffocating band around his neck. He expected a model, or an heiress, or some combination of the two. He pictured a woman with a face sculpted by expensive surgeons and a laugh polished by years of social maneuvering. He pictured a conversation as hollow as the clinking of champagne glasses, a performance of interest that would exhaust him before the appetizer arrived. The entire ordeal felt like a transaction, another clause in the contract of his life he was forced to honor. The rain intensified, beating a frantic, angry rhythm against the glass, a perfect echo of the storm inside him. The restaurant was an exercise in ostentatious minimalism. A single, perfect orchid graced each table, and the lighting was so artfully dim it felt conspiratorial. Julian sat at his reserved table, a small island of starched white linen in a sea of hushed conversations and the subtle scent of money. He checked his watch, a platinum band cold against his skin. She was 3 minutes late. It was a power play he recognized, a small, calculated assertion of value. He signaled the waiter for a glass of scotch, the amber liquid a small, familiar comfort. Then, she walked in, and the carefully constructed image in his mind shattered. She was not the woman he had been prepared for. She paused at the entrance, her eyes scanning the opulent room with a quiet nervousness that was utterly out of place. Her dress was simple, a modest navy blue that was impeccably clean but showed the subtle signs of wear at the seams. Her hair was pulled back in a simple knot, and her face, devoid of the lacquered perfection he'd expected, was open and honest, etched with a faint tiredness around the eyes that only made her seem more real. She approached the table, her steps hesitant. "Julian Croft?" she asked, her voice softer than the curated quiet of the room. He nodded, his initial annoyance giving way to a profound sense of confusion. This was not the strategic match he had been promised. This was a mistake. She was ordinary, and in his world, ordinary was a liability. He felt a surge of irritation, not at her, but at the absurdity of the situation. "You must be my date," he said, the words feeling foreign and clumsy. He gestured to the chair opposite him, a perfunctory motion. She sat, placing a slightly worn handbag on her lap, her hands folded neatly on top of it. He saw her glance at the menu, her eyes widening almost imperceptibly at the prices. The silence between them stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Julian took a sip of his scotch, the burn doing little to calm the dissonance in his mind. He was about to utter some cold, dismissive pleasantry to get the evening over with when the chaos erupted. A waiter, young and flustered, stumbled near the adjacent table where a family was celebrating a child's birthday. A silver tray laden with bowls of steaming soup tilted precariously. Time seemed to slow. Julian saw the trajectory, the arc of the scalding liquid heading directly for the little girl in the high chair, her face bright with laughter. He registered the danger with a detached, analytical coldness, his mind calculating the potential for a lawsuit, the disruption, the mess. But Elena moved. She didn't think. She reacted. In a single, fluid motion, she was out of her chair, her body a shield between the falling soup and the child. The hot liquid splashed across the floor and onto her arm. A sharp hiss of pain escaped her lips, but she ignored it. Her focus was entirely on the little girl, who had begun to cry, startled by the crash. "Sure, it's okay, sweetie. It's okay," Elena murmured, her voice a low, soothing balm. She knelt, her hand gently touching the child's shoulder, her eyes full of a calm, reassuring warmth. "It was just a loud noise. See, everything is all right." The child's cries subsided into hiccups, her wide, tearful eyes fixed on Elena's face. The parents rushed over, frantic, thanking her profusely. The restaurant staff descended, a flurry of apologies and concern. Julian watched, frozen in his seat. He had not moved a muscle. He had analyzed. He had assessed. She had acted. She had comforted. She had protected. She cradled her arm, an angry red mark already blooming on her skin, yet her attention remained on the child and the distraught parents. She waved off the manager's frantic offers of assistance, assuring everyone she was fine. She returned to the table, a slight tremor in her hands as she picked up her water glass. The manager arrived with a first aid kit, but she calmly and efficiently dressed the minor burn herself, her movements practiced and sure. "I'm a nurse," she explained softly, as if that single fact accounted for everything. Julian simply stared at her. In the space of 30 seconds, she had dismantled every cynical expectation he held. In a world of calculated gestures, he had just witnessed an act of pure, unthinking kindness. It was the most honest thing he had seen in years, and it left him utterly speechless. He drove her home. The pretense of the date had evaporated, replaced by a strange, contemplative silence. Her small apartment building was on a quiet, tree-lined street, a world away from the cold glass towers of his own neighborhood. He insisted on walking her to the door, a gesture born not of etiquette, but of a sudden, inexplicable need to ensure she was safe. "Thank you for dinner," she said, her voice still quiet. "And for the ride." She looked at her bandaged arm, then back at him. It was an eventful evening. A small, wry smile touched her lips, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of light in her tired eyes. "Are you sure you're all right?" he asked, the question feeling inadequate. "It's just a small burn. I've had much worse from stray spaghetti sauce," she said, the attempt at humor gentle and unassuming. She hesitated at her door, as if wrestling with a thought. "Look," she finally said, meeting his gaze directly. "I should be honest. I wasn't supposed to be here tonight. My friend, Clara, was. She's a model. She's the one the agency set you up with. She had a last-minute job, and she panicked. She begged me to go in her place. She said it was important not to offend anyone." The confession hung in the air between them. It explained everything. The ill-fitting clothes, the nervousness, the shock at the menu prices. She hadn't been playing a power game by being late. She had likely been trying to talk herself into going through with the charade. Julian felt a strange wave of relief. The dissonance he'd felt was gone. She wasn't a mistake. She was just a woman trying to help a friend. "She paid me to be here," Elena added, her voice barely a whisper, as if ashamed. "I needed the money. My son. His school trip is next month." The vulnerability in that admission was a physical blow. It was so raw, so far removed from the polished deceptions of his own life. He should have been angry at the deceit, but all he felt was a disarming sense of clarity. "Thank you for telling me," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Your friend owes you more than she paid you." He looked at the closed door behind her, imagining a small boy sleeping inside. "Good night, Elena." He had learned her name from the hostess when he confirmed the reservation, and saying it now felt significant. He walked back to his car, the sound of his expensive shoes echoing on the damp pavement. The rain had stopped, and the air was clean and cold. For the first time in a long time, Julian Croft felt something other than the crushing weight of his own world. He felt intrigued. The next day, Julian's curiosity had crystallized into a quiet obsession. He had his assistant, a man of terrifying efficiency and absolute discretion, look into Elena Vance. The report that landed on his desk was a slim file, its contents simple and profoundly sad. She was a pediatric nurse at City General Hospital, 34 years old, widowed, Her husband, Daniel Vance, had been a construction worker. He had died 3 years prior in a scaffolding collapse. They had one son, Leo, aged 7. Julian stared at the name of the construction site. North Tower Project, a subsidiary of Croft Holdings. A cold dread, sharp and unfamiliar, coiled in his stomach. He didn't remember the incident specifically. There were always incidents, distant reports sanitized by corporate lawyers and settled with checks that were simultaneously enormous and insulting. He pushed the thought away, telling himself it was a coincidence, a tragedy that had nothing to do with him personally. He had only been CEO for 2 years. This had happened under his father's watch. Still, the knowledge sat like a stone inside him. He found himself making a call to the hospital's administrative department. Within the hour, he had pledged a 7-figure donation to fund a new pediatric oncology wing. The call was a pretense, a clumsy and transparent excuse. He knew it, and he didn't care. He arranged to tour the facilities the following afternoon, citing a desire to see firsthand where his money would be going. The pediatric ward was a riot of color and noise, a stark contrast to the sterile beige of the rest of the hospital. Murals of cartoon animals covered the walls, and the squeak of small sneakers echoed in the hallway. He felt like a foreigner in this land of brave, tiny inhabitants. He saw Elena before she saw him. She was sitting on the floor in a playroom, her back to the door, reading a story to a small girl with no hair, her voice a gentle, animated murmur. The child was captivated, her face, pale and thin, alight with a fragile joy. Elena was not just doing a job. She was inhabiting a space of pure, unadulterated care. Julian watched for a long moment, unseen, feeling the cynical armor he wore every day begin to crack. The hospital director finally led him into the room, announcing his presence with a reverence that made Julian cringe. Elena looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. She got to her feet, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice professional but with an undercurrent of shock. "What are you doing here?" "I was just touring the facility," he said, the excuse sounding feeble even to his own ears. He looked at the little girl, who was now staring at him with solemn, intelligent eyes. "Hello," the girl gave him a shy wave. Later, they stood in a quiet alcove overlooking a small garden. "That was a generous thing you did," Elena said, her gaze fixed on the greenery below. "That wing, it will change lives." "It's just money," he replied, the words tasting like ash. He wanted to tell her the real reason he was there. He wanted to ask about her son, about her life, but the words felt intrusive. Instead, he found himself asking about her arm. "It's fine," she said, pulling back her sleeve to show him the fading red mark. "See? Good as new." Their fingers brushed as she lowered her sleeve, a spark of warmth that seemed to travel straight through him. The connection was brief, accidental, but it felt more real than any handshake he had ever exchanged in a boardroom. It was in that moment he decided he needed to see her again, outside the context of secret dates and hospital tours. He wanted to see her world, the one she fought so hard to protect. His opportunity came in the form of a hospital charity gala. He bought a table and sent a single invitation to her apartment. It wasn't a request. It was a simple, elegant card that said, "Please join me." Table 12-inch. He half expected her to refuse, to see it as an arrogant summons from a world she didn't belong to. But on the night of the gala, she was there. She wore a simple, floor-length gown in a deep emerald green that she had clearly rented for the occasion. It didn't matter. She radiated a quiet dignity that outshone all the diamonds in the room. They barely spoke during the endless dinner and speeches. Instead, a silent conversation flowed between them. He watched her, and she seemed to feel his gaze, occasionally meeting his eyes across the table with a small, questioning smile. He felt a sense of peace settle over him, a feeling so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. For the first time, he wasn't Julian Croft, CEO. He was just a man, sitting with a woman whose quiet strength fascinated him. After the gala, he found himself at her apartment door again. This time, he had brought something with him. 2 containers of takeout from a simple diner he'd passed on the way. "I thought you might be hungry," he said. "No one ever actually eats at those things." She laughed, a genuine, warm sound that filled the small hallway. "You are absolutely right," she let him in. Her apartment was small but immaculately clean, and filled with a warmth his own penthouse sorely lacked. Framed drawings, clearly the work of a child, adorned the walls. A stack of books sat on the coffee table. It was a home, not just a residence. And then he saw him. A small boy with his mother's dark hair and wide, curious eyes stood in the doorway of his bedroom, clutching a stuffed dinosaur. "Leo," Elena said softly. "This is Mr. Croft." "Julian." Leo stared at Julian, his expression serious. "Are you my mom's boyfriend?" he asked, his voice clear and direct. Elena's face flushed. "Leo, go back to bed." Julian found himself smiling. "It's nice to meet you, Leo," he said, kneeling to the boy's level. "I like your dinosaur." Leo held it out. "His name is Steggy. He's a herbivore." The boy's complete lack of intimidation was refreshing. He didn't see a billionaire. He saw a tall man in his mother's apartment. He judged Julian on a far simpler metric. After a moment of solemn consideration, Leo seemed to come to a decision. He walked back into his room and returned a moment later, holding something in his small hands. He held it out to Julian. It was a small, lopsided bird, sculpted from air-dry clay and painted a cheerful, if uneven, blue. "I made this for you," Leo said, "so you won't be lonely." The simple, profound statement struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. This child, with an innocence Julian had forgotten could exist, had seen straight through the expensive suit, the confident posture, and the carefully constructed walls. He had seen the truth of him, a lonely man. Julian took the small clay bird, its lumpy form surprisingly heavy in his hand. It was the most valuable thing he had ever been given. "Thank you, Leo," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I will keep it safe." He looked up at Elena, whose eyes were shining with unshed tears. In that small, cluttered living room, holding a child's simple gift, Julian felt the tectonic plates of his world shift. The foundation of wealth and power he had built his life upon suddenly felt fragile and meaningless. All that mattered was the quiet warmth of this room and the two people in it. The weeks that followed unfolded like a secret, gentle season. Julian found himself making excuses to be near Elena and Leo. He would show up at the park near their apartment with coffee, feigning a break from work. He helped Leo with a school project, a diorama of the solar system built from styrofoam balls and glitter, a task that brought him a ridiculous amount of joy. He ate dinner with them in their small kitchen, simple meals of pasta and salad that tasted better than anything the Michelin-starred chefs of the city could produce. He learned the rhythms of their life. He learned that Elena hummed when she cooked, that Leo had a small, chipped tooth from a fall off his scooter, and that they had a ritual of reading one chapter of a book together every night before bed. These small, mundane details were anchors, pulling him out of the sterile isolation of his own existence and into the warm, messy reality of theirs. He was shedding his old life like a skin, and he didn't miss it. He told Elena about the immense pressure of his job, the suffocating weight of his father's legacy, and the profound emptiness of his success. She listened without judgment, her presence a quiet harbor. In return, she spoke of her husband, Daniel. She didn't speak of him with maudlin grief, but with a gentle, loving nostalgia. She told Julian how Daniel had been able to fix anything, how he had a laugh that could fill a room, and how much he had adored their son. "He was a good man," she said one evening, sitting on her small balcony as the city lights began to bloom below. "He believed in doing the right thing, always. Even when it was hard." Her words resonated with a painful clarity, stirring the guilt that still lingered in the back of Julian's mind about the construction accident. He knew he would have to face it, but the thought of his company's connection to her loss being revealed filled him with a paralyzing fear. He was terrified that the truth would destroy the fragile trust they were building. The crisis arrived, as crises often do, not with a sudden explosion, but with the quiet click of a folder being placed on his desk. Marcus Thorne, his ambitious and utterly ruthless chief operating officer, stood before him, a smug smile playing on his lips. "The preliminary reports for the new waterfront development," Marcus announced. "We can cut projected costs by 12%. Julian flipped through the report. The numbers were impressive, but he knew Marcus. The cuts would not come from efficiency. They would come from corners being cut. He found it in the fine print. A cheaper supplier for the structural steel, a reduction in the number of safety inspectors on site. It was a disaster waiting to happen, a calculated risk that gambled with human lives for the sake of a few points on a stock report. Absolutely not, Marcus, Julian said, his voice cold and hard. Find the savings somewhere else. We don't compromise on safety. Marcus's smile tightened. With all due respect, Julian, your father would have approved this in a heartbeat. This is how the game is played. It's the Croft way. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It's how the North Tower got built ahead of schedule and under budget. A few calculated risks, a few settlements paid out for minor incidents. It's the cost of doing business. The North Tower. The name hit Julian like a physical punch. The site where Daniel Vance had died. What minor incidents? Julian demanded, his voice dangerously low. Marcus shrugged, oblivious to the storm gathering in Julian's eyes. You know, the usual. A few injuries. There was that one fatality, the scaffolding thing. We took care of the family, of course. A quiet settlement, a non-disclosure agreement. It was all handled, buried deep. My point is, this is the playbook that built this company. The board expects you to follow it. The blood drained from Julian's face. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a direct consequence. The company his father had built, the empire he now commanded, was responsible for the death of the man Elena loved. The cost-cutting, the calculated risks, the quiet settlement. It was a system that had orphaned her son and left her a widow. And now, Marcus was standing here, proposing to do it all over again. The guilt he had been suppressing rose up like bile. He felt a profound sense of self-loathing. His entire life, his wealth, his privilege, it was all built on a foundation of this casual, callous disregard for human life. He looked at the clay bird Leo had given him, which sat on the corner of his desk. He thought of Elena's words. He believed in doing the right thing, always. Even when it was hard. He had a choice. He could sign the papers, play the game, and preserve the empire. He could bury the truth and keep the fragile happiness he had found with Elena and Leo, a happiness built on a terrible, corrosive lie. Or he could burn it all to the ground. He could choose integrity over profit. He could choose to be the man Elena believed him to be, the man Leo had seen in him. It was the hardest choice of his life. That night, Julian drove, not to his own empty penthouse, but to the warm, small world he had come to crave. He found himself on Elena's doorstep, the weight of his decision pressing down on him so heavily he could barely breathe. When she opened the door, the look on his face must have told her everything. She didn't ask questions. She simply stepped aside and let him in. He collapsed onto her sofa, the carefully constructed facade of Julian Croft, CEO, crumbling into dust. He couldn't bring himself to speak, to confess the ugly truth that connected them. The words were lodged in his throat, sharp and painful. He was a fraud, sitting in the home of the woman whose life his family's company had destroyed. Elena disappeared into the kitchen and returned a few moments later with a steaming mug of tea. She placed it in his trembling hands. She didn't pry or demand an explanation. She simply sat in the armchair across from him, her presence a silent, unwavering anchor in his storm. The quiet in the room was not empty. It was filled with an unspoken understanding, a profound sense of safety. After a long time, he finally looked at her, his eyes raw with unshed tears. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered, the words ragged. She met his gaze, her own eyes full of a deep, uncomplicated compassion. "Whatever it is," she said softly, her voice a lifeline. "You have to do what you know is right. You still have your spine, Julian. A lot of people lose that." She paused, then added, "You'll do the right thing. It's who you are." Her faith in him was a devastating blow. She saw a goodness in him he did not feel he possessed. She believed in his moral compass, a compass he felt had been broken for years. And in that moment, her simple, powerful belief became his own. He knew what he had to do. The cost no longer mattered. His empire was not worth his soul. The next morning, Julian called an emergency meeting of the board. The air in the boardroom was thick with tension and the smell of expensive coffee. The men and women seated around the polished mahogany table were the titans of the city, their faces impassive masks of power and influence. Marcus Thorne sat to Julian's right, a confident smirk on his face, assuming the meeting was to announce the approval of his cost-cutting measures. Julian stood at the head of the table, the clay bird from Leo tucked safely in his pocket, its lumpy form a tangible reminder of what was truly at stake. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with a quiet, chilling calm that commanded more attention than any outburst ever could. He began by announcing that the waterfront development project was being overhauled, with a new, non-negotiable emphasis on safety protocols that would double the projected cost. Gasps rippled through the room. But he didn't stop there. He slid a new file across the table towards the lead counsel. "This contains documents pertaining to the North Tower project from 4 years ago," he stated, his voice ringing with cold authority. Specifically, it details a pattern of willful negligence, falsified safety reports, and a subsequent cover-up regarding the death of a worker, Daniel Vance. Marcus Thorne's face went white. The smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of pure panic. The room erupted into a cacophony of protests and denials. Julian held up a hand, and the room fell silent. "Marcus Thorne is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort him from the building. His actions, and the actions of the previous administration, are a stain on this company. A stain I intend to remove." He then delivered the final, decisive blow. "I am personally funding a new foundation, the Daniel Vance Memorial Fund, with an initial endowment of $100 million. Its sole purpose will be to support the families of workers killed or injured due to corporate negligence in our industry. Furthermore, I am unsealing all records related to the North Tower settlement and turning them over to the district attorney's office. We will accept full liability." The cover-up ends today. He looked around the table, meeting the stunned, furious gaze of each board member. "This is no longer the company my father built. This is the company I will lead. If any of you disagree with this new direction, your resignations will be accepted by the end of the day." He walked out of the room, leaving a maelstrom of shock and fury in his wake. He didn't look back. He had sacrificed his legacy, his relationship with the board, and likely a significant portion of his fortune. He had detonated a bomb in the center of his own life. And for the first time, he felt completely, utterly free. His next stop was not his office, but Elena's small apartment. This was the hardest part, the true moment of reckoning. He stood at her door, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had to tell her everything, the full, ugly truth of his connection to her pain. He had to face the consequences of his family's actions. She let him in, her expression questioning as she saw the strange mix of terror and relief on his face. He didn't sit down. He stood in the middle of her living room, the space that had become his sanctuary, and he confessed. He told her about the North Tower, about the cost-cutting, about the cover-up. He told her that the company that bore his name, the wealth that had defined his entire life, was responsible for Daniel's death. The words tumbled out of him, raw and unfiltered. He didn't make excuses or try to soften the blow. He laid the truth bare, a toxic offering at her feet. "I didn't know until yesterday," he finished, his voice breaking. "But that doesn't matter. It was my family, my company. It's my responsibility. I am so sorry, Elena." Tears streamed down his face, hot and shameful. He stood before her, stripped of all his power and prestige, waiting for her judgment. He expected anger, hatred, revulsion. He expected her to scream at him, to throw him out, to erase him from her life forever. Elena was silent for a long time, her face pale, her eyes searching his. He could see the shock, the pain, the dawning horror as his words sank in. But underneath it all, there was something else, something he didn't expect. He saw the woman who had instinctively shielded a child from harm, the nurse who had comforted countless frightened patients, the mother who had raised a kind and empathetic son. When she finally spoke, her voice was a trembling whisper. "You blew it all up," she said, more a statement of fact than a question. "You told them everything. You sacrificed everything." "It was the only right thing to do," he choked out. She took a hesitant step towards him, then another. She reached out, not to strike him, but to gently wipe a tear from his cheek with her thumb. "Daniel, he would have liked you," she whispered, her own tears beginning to fall. "He would have respected what you did today, in that moment of impossible grace, of forgiveness he had not earned and did not deserve." Julian Croft finally broke. He wrapped his arms around her and sobbed, a lifetime of loneliness and guilt pouring out of him. And she held him, her small frame a bastion of strength, her quiet compassion the only absolution he had ever needed. Their shared victory was not loud or triumphant. It was a quiet, tearful relief in the middle of a small living room, a bond forged not in spite of the tragedy that connected them, but through the painful, honest reckoning with it. 1 year later, the autumn sun cast a warm, golden light on the small crowd gathered in front of a new, modern building. The crisp air was filled with the sounds of happy chatter and the rustle of falling leaves. The sign above the door read, "The Daniel Vance Community Health Center." It was the first major project of Julian's foundation, a state-of-the-art facility offering free and low-cost medical care to the neighborhood. Julian stood a little off to the side, watching the ceremony. He wore a simple sweater and slacks, a far cry from the bespoke suits that had once been his uniform. He was no longer the CEO of Croft Holdings. After the scandal broke, he had stepped down, selling a majority of his shares and pouring the profits into the foundation. The public response to his whistleblowing had been overwhelmingly positive, turning him into an unlikely hero of corporate reform. He now ran the foundation from a small, unassuming office, a job that brought him more satisfaction than any multi-billion-dollar deal ever had. Elena stood at the podium, speaking to the crowd. She spoke of her husband's memory, of his belief in community, and of the hope that this center would bring. She was poised and confident, her voice clear and strong. She no longer looked tired. A deep, quiet joy radiated from her. When she finished, she looked directly at Julian, a smile of such profound love and gratitude on her face that it took his breath away. Leo, now 8 years old and missing a front tooth, wriggled free from the crowd and ran to Julian's side, grabbing his hand. "Mommy did good," he whispered conspiratorially. "She did amazing," Julian agreed, ruffling the boy's hair. He looked from Leo's bright, happy face to Elena, who was now walking towards them, and a feeling of profound rightness settled over him. His old life of sterile penthouses and cold boardrooms felt like a distant, half-forgotten dream. This was real. The warmth of Leo's small hand in his, the love in Elena's eyes, the tangible good they were putting into the world. This was his new foundation. This was home. Later that evening, the three of them were in the living room of their new house, a comfortable home with a sprawling backyard and enough scuff marks on the walls to prove it was truly lived in. The lopsided clay bird Leo had made sat on the mantelpiece, a treasured icon. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow on their faces. They were building a puzzle on the floor, a chaotic mess of cardboard pieces that was slowly becoming a picture of a starry night sky. Leo fit a piece into place with a triumphant aha. He picked up a framed drawing from the end table, a recent creation made with bright, waxy crayons. It depicted 3 stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun. "Look," he said, pointing a finger at each figure in turn. "That's Mommy. That's me." He then tapped the third, taller figure. "And that's you." He looked up at Julian, his expression one of simple, unwavering certainty. "You're my dad now." The words, spoken with the pure, uncomplicated honesty of a child, landed directly in the center of Julian's heart. All the pain, all the sacrifice, all the turmoil of the past year coalesced into this one perfect, crystalline moment. He felt Elena's hand find his, her fingers lacing through his own. He looked at her, his eyes swimming with an emotion so deep it had no name. She was smiling, her eyes shining in the firelight. He gently reached out his other hand and brushed his fingers over the faint, silvery scar that remained on her forearm, the ghost of the burn she had received on the night they met. It was a small, insignificant mark, but to him, it was a symbol of everything. It was the moment his old world had begun to crumble and this new, beautiful one had begun to rise from the ashes. He leaned in and pressed a soft, reverent kiss to the scar. He was no longer the wounded executive, and she was no longer just a survivor. They were a family, chosen and built, one day, one puzzle piece, one quiet act of love at a time.